For those of you who don't know me, I have tried to run around the room and introduce myself or meet you all as much as possible. My name again is Marissa Yáñez. I am a member of this community, born just up the street, and I am also an alumni of this institution. I grew up in a time when I was the only Latina in Los Altos Hills. It was the 80s. It was a very difficult time to be here as first-gen immigrants. That my parents came from Peru and Panama from nothing. They worked as hard as they could, even just to learn English, and then to put themselves through school so that we could have the opportunity to do anything that we wanted in the world. But I had severely undiagnosed ADHD myself. I knew that I was smart. I tested into the gifted and talented education program. I skipped a grade, but I had a hard time focusing, and honestly, I didn't really know why we had to learn everything we were learning in school, nor how it had any impact in the real world, and so I was not a kid that was super into school growing up. As a senior, I got into UC San Diego, and I knew that because I didn't quite know what I wanted to do, I would probably be wasting my time. And to the dismay of my parents, who worked so hard so that I could go anywhere and be anything, I chose to come down the hill to Foothill College. But it was here that I started to find my footing. I started to feel a little bit more comfortable in my own skin, and I started to, and then, through the resources of the Disability Resource Center, I also was properly diagnosed and treated with ADHD. And then as a second-year psychology major, somebody like me came into my classroom and totally changed my life. This person came to talk about the engineering internships at NASA that were available exclusively for Foothill and De Anza students. And something when I heard the word NASA, I thought, I want to work at NASA. Who doesn't want to work at NASA? And more than that, I was making $5 an hour at Baskin-Robbins, and these internships paid $12.50 an hour, and 2.5 times my income from 1 minute to the next. Sign me up. So I applied, not really thinking anything of it, and I got an interview. And they said, you need to bring a resume. I didn't know what a resume was, and rather than ask for help, I typed up 3 pages about myself and why they should hire me, and I brought it with me. And the hiring manager took one look at it and said, this is not a resume. In fact, he says, this is the worst resume I've ever seen in my life. But he looked me in the eye and he said, I don't know, there's something about you. I'm kind of inclined to give you a chance, but we'll see. And I don't know what came over me, but I was walking the halls of NASA and I was like, I belong here, much like Christine said at Stanford. And I said, I don't know what there is here, but there's something for me here. And I said, if you give me a chance, you are not going to regret it. And he did. I got the internship, and shortly after, I was given a chance to work on a piece of hardware that was going up into space. There was a camera inside that needed to stay at room temperature, and outside would be space. So it was a heat transfer problem, and I had to figure out which materials would insulate the camera so it stayed at room temperature. And he handed me the specs and a book on heat transfer and said, figure it out. So I took the book home and I opened it up, and it was like the first time I started to see how the chemistry and the physics and the calculus that I had been learning in school, how it all came together to actually solve a problem in the real world. And that was like, all the networks in my brain that had been just kind of like disconnected and couldn't put everything together, all started to come together, and my brain just like started to turn on. And I could not get my nose out of this book. And my parents, who had never seen me read more than 2 pages at a time without getting distracted, saw me spend hours and hours in this heat transfer book. And I knew that I was in it. I knew that something had turned on and I was good at it and I enjoyed it. So I went to my counselor and I said, okay, I'm switching my major. That was a mechanical engineering internship. I said, I'm switching my major to mechanical engineering. And I stayed an extra year, finished all my STEM classes, and was accepted to UC Berkeley. And I get to UC Berkeley, and my first semester I got straight A's. And my teacher said, you're good at school, you're good at this, you should keep going to school. I didn't think much of it until one day I was introduced to a woman who was introduced to me as the first Latina accepted into the prestigious bioengineering PhD program between UC Berkeley and UC San Francisco. And I looked at her and I was like, a Latina PhD in engineering? I didn't even know this was something that existed in society, nor had I ever thought this was something that was relevant to me. But I looked at her and I said, she's a Latina PhD in engineering? I can do that too. And I said, she's the first to get into this program, I'm gonna be the second. And I was. I had learned at Berkeley how engineering and biology could be combined to create devices that would improve health. And I liked that because I liked the impact on improving the lives of people. And I decided to switch my major I decided to get a PhD in bioengineering. I got a perfect score on the GREs and got into all the programs I was accepted to. And they all invited me to come and visit. So as I started to tour Georgia Tech, Harvard, MIT, Berkeley, Stanford, Penn, I started to meet with professors to talk about their research. And I had another realization. I wanted to work on biomedical research, biomedical engineering projects that were impacting the communities who needed it most. The communities for whom health outcomes are the lowest, are the worst. Communities of color, low-income communities, communities in developing countries, and more after more. I could not find projects that were relevant to these communities. Until I got to the University of Washington. They had gotten new money from Gates to develop biomedical technologies for developing countries, and I thought that was my calling. So I go up to the University of Washington for my PhD, only to find out that money was going to be implemented in 5 to 7 years. So I had to end up picking a project that I didn't really love, but I did it and I got my PhD, but a little light in me kind of started to fade because I couldn't do the kind of research that I wanted to do. And shortly after graduation, I got an opportunity to go to the NIH, the National Institute of Health. I took a job at the NIH to work on health and science policy. Obama had just taken office and he had developed a list of national priority goals for the country, and we had to figure out, or I had to identify metrics that would start to quantify how much of NIH's funding actually aligned with the needs of the public. So I started to meet with all of the different leaders and directors of the different 27 institutes of the National Institutes of Health. And more, after conversation after conversation, I started to realize what I had already realized 7 years prior, that the majority of biomedical research that was happening in this country impacted only an elite few. And where were the projects that impacted the majority of the world's populations? I felt this need that we need more equity in the way we fund science. We need more equity in the way that scientific advancements can impact and improve society for all, not just an elite few. But in room after room, just like throughout my graduate program where I was the only woman of color with 125 graduate students, in room after room at the NIH, I was the only one in the room who looked like me. And there's only so much you can do, a single voice, trying to affect change from the top down. Obama at the time was constantly repeating a mantra: true change happens from the bottom up, not from the top down. And there I was in my office at the office of the director at the NIH trying to implement change as a singular voice from the top down. And I thought I need to start from the bottom up. So I left the NIH. I love to salsa dance. Anyone who knows me knows that. I was enamored with New York City. I moved up to New York City and I started connecting with different organizations that were building STEM education and computer science education programs in Washington Heights, in Harlem, in the Bronx, and I learned from them. And eventually I started my own nonprofit, Empoder, which means to empower in Spanish. But my calling was not to do this work in New York City. My calling is here in Silicon Valley, the place where I'd grown up, the place where I was born, and the place where in our generation we've seen the biggest generation of wealth in one single generation in the history of our time. At the same time, this has become the place with one of the greatest income inequalities in the world. The gap between the haves and the have-nots is greater than even in the country of Somalia. And despite the fact that more than 50% of high school students in the Valley today, being they are Latino or Black, less than 2% of people who work technical jobs in Silicon Valley are Latino or Black. And a mile down the street from Google and Facebook, there are schools where more than 80 or 90% of students qualify for free reduced lunch. Low-income communities still make up the majority of the Valley, and there seems to be an iron wall between the two worlds. This was where I was meant to build pipelines to connect the two sides. This was my calling. I came back to Silicon Valley, and the year was 2014. Google and Facebook had just released their diversity numbers for the first time, and the media got hold of this, and there was outrage all over the place about the lack of diversity in tech. So the time was right. And the next thing I know, I'm getting introduced to companies all over the valley through Oscar Garcia, who was president of the Mountain View Chamber of Commerce at the time. I was also getting invited by the CEO of YouTube to come have lunch with her one-on-one. I was getting 100,000 from Google here and 50,000 from other companies, and I said, this is where I'm going to build my pipeline. I launched computer science education programs in schools in Mountain View and East Palo Alto for girls in the poorest communities to come and start a pipeline. But as we all know, the news cycle is something one day and the next day it changes. And when diversity in tech in 1 year to the next no longer became a trending topic, what was one day 100,000 here and 50,000 there, I found myself fighting for 5,000 here and 10,000 there. And that's not how you build sustainable systems and infrastructure that's going to close the greatest wealth inequality in the world. So that was hard. After 3 or 4 years of fighting the good fight, I thought maybe I can affect change from the inside out. So I took a job in tech, paid great, wonderful, and I was tasked with developing programs to empower developers across Latin America. And in a very, almost on day one, maybe even before day one, I quickly realized that my goals and priorities did not exactly line up with the goals and priorities of the corporate tech world. And so that didn't last too long. I felt myself longing for the work I had left behind, and like I had sold out, to be honest. And when I would meet people, that I throughout the tech ecosystems in Latin America on behalf of my job, they would ask me about what I did prior, and then my face would light up, and they would tell me, hey, when you talk about that, your face lights up, but it's not lighting up right now, and I knew that. But as I traveled throughout Latin America, I started to see what was actually working, what's creating transformational change across Latin America, and I came across a nonprofit that was truly making transformational change for women from low-income communities all across Latin America. The nonprofit was Laboratoria. They had created a 6-month boot camp to train low-income women within 6 months to get entry-level jobs into tech as junior developers. And they were tripling and sometimes quadrupling their income. And they recruited me to come be their country director for Mexico. So I left the Valley again in 2018 and moved to Mexico City to lead the nonprofit's efforts in Mexico. And as much as I loved the work we were doing, I knew, and I learned so much from it, I knew this wasn't where we needed it most. I'm from Silicon Valley. This is the place with the greatest income inequality. This is the place where we need to build these pipelines. This is the place where we need to make these transformational changes. So in the pandemic, I came back. I revived my nonprofit in a virtual space, which was not exactly easy. And through a number of serendipitous events, I met Sophia. And as I learned more about the work that SLI was doing or what the mission was, I was inspired to come join the effort to build out and scale and strengthen and grow our internship program to create this real pipeline that we have going, this real pipeline that is empowering our students today through our internships. In the last year and a half, we've built and scaled our programs. We've placed over 100 students in some of the most competitive research labs across the Valley, mostly at Stanford and in tech and biotech companies. And we have built out an infrastructure that supports our students across every single step of the way. From the target outreach we do to reach our target demographic, to the support we give them to applying for the internships, to the coaching and mentorship and professional development that we give them during the internships, to the mentorship we give them beyond, and to the mentorship that we give even the mentors at our host institutions so that they have the skills and knowledge of how they can be the most inclusive and empowering mentors to our students. All of that is what's leading to the stories that you hear today. All of that, it's not just the opportunity, it's the system and infrastructure in place that supports them throughout the entire pipeline. 70 students in our last year, in our last 2 programs, completed internships, and 100% of those students were either from low-income backgrounds, first gen in their family to go to college, or Black or Latinx. 100%. So we're 100% meeting our target demographic. And we're creating the first meaningful pipeline in the place that needs it most that I've ever had the honor of witnessing or working on in my life. But we can't do this alone. The growth and the change that we've seen in the last year and a half is unsustainable without a community that helps elevate it to the next level. The endowment that started this internship program is set to run out of funding in a year. And, you know, we don't always talk about it, but this amazing work, we have to fight for every $1,000 here and $1,000 there, and it's so much work, and there are 2 of us doing this, with a few students that help us, you know, as paid student employees. And that's not sustainable. So the progress that we've seen in the last 2 years, this cannot just be a blip that rises and falls as the trends die from one minute to the next. It has to be the beginning of reaching our true potential. And what does that potential look like? We can bring more students from low-income communities. They are all over the valley. We can bring more of them here. This is an Ivy League on the Hill that provides a world-class STEM education that is accessible for all. Anybody can come here. Let's reach out and bring all our students in the valley and put them through our STEM education and then get them internships into tech. More so, let's increase their stipends. 20 years ago, my stipend was 2.5 times the minimum wage. Today we pay the same as the minimum wage in Mountain View to our students. Let's do better for them. I've heard rumblings here and there of putting a dorm on campus so that students have a stable place to live. Some of our students that you've heard from today are having to move to Sacramento and commuting 3 hours each way just so they have a place to live where they can attend Foothill because they know the value of what is here. Let's build a dorm on campus so our students who need it most have a stable place to live so that they can get the best education and get an internship and break into tech. We have the system here to do it, but we need a community to really reach our true potential and our true promise. We have here a pipeline that I've never seen anywhere before, a real pipeline that's working, that's accessible for all. We have the power to change the face of tech. We have the power to not get people, students, entry-level jobs in tech as junior developers, but we have the power to empower the next generation of scientists, of innovators, of leaders, so that they're the ones advancing science and technology so that it's equitable for all, so that it improves outcomes for all. Because we will not live in an equitable world until science and technology advancements are actually improving outcomes for everyone, not just for an elite few. And we need the critical mass of scientists and engineers from these diversity communities to do it. This is maybe the most important work that is needed in the world today, but we cannot do this ourselves. So let's start with this people in this very room. Let's pool our resources, our knowledge, our expertise, our connections. Let's work together as a community to uplift and reach our true potential and reach the promise that we have to change the face of the valley. We are a country that put the first man on the moon. Let's put our students on the moon. Let's empower them to put the next generation of people on the moon and beyond. We are in the most powerful place in the world. It's all right here. Last year, Mackenzie Scott gave $4 million of unrestricted funds to Laboratoria, the place where I was the country director. And that money is empowering women all over Latin America. But let's empower our very own. They are the ones that have the greatest access. We can change the face of science and technology. We can create a more equitable world. But we need to do it all together. And we can do anything. So let's do it.